Welcome to Hidden Infidelity Diaries, where we reveal the secrets and stories of unfaithfulness.
It was well past midnight, but sleep was nowhere in sight. I had been tossing and turning in bed for hours, my thoughts circling the same empty spaces they had for years. Finally, I gave up, throwing off the covers and heading to the kitchen to get a glass of water. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator, but as I passed the living room, I noticed the light was still on. For a moment, I thought I might have forgotten to turn it off. But then, I remembered. I wasn't alone. That night marked a week since Derek, my older brother, had shown up at my doorstep with a desperate plea. "Megan, he needs you," he'd said, his voice heavy with the kind of concern that only family can bring. "Evan's not himself. He just needs a little peace, somewhere to breathe." When Derek told me what had happened to Evan, my heart sank. His wife of over a decade, someone he had loved, trusted, and built a life with, had betrayed him in the worst way. The details were hazy. Derek didn't say much, and I didn't press. All I knew was that Evan had been blindsided, his world shattered in an instant. "Take him in, please," Derek had begged me. "He's lost, Megan. I don't know where else to turn." And so, Evan had come to stay with me, a man I barely knew really. Life had a way of pulling our family apart, scattering us into our own little corners of the world. The last time I'd seen him, he was a teenager with a full head of dark curls, his whole life ahead of him. Now, at 35, he was a shadow of that boy, carrying the weight of betrayal on his shoulders. I hadn't said no, of course. How could I? After everything we'd been through as a family, I couldn't turn my back on him. But as I stood in the kitchen that night, staring at the glass in my hand, I realized just how unprepared I was for what it meant to have someone else in the house, especially someone as broken as Evan. The truth was, I had my own wounds to carry. 7 years ago, I lost my husband, James, to a sudden heart attack. One minute, we were planning our dream home, a little cottage on the edge of town with a garden big enough to grow anything we wanted, and the next, he was gone. Just like that. It had taken years for the shock to wear off, and even now, the grief hadn't really left. It just sat there, quiet and heavy, like an old piece of furniture I couldn't bring myself to move. Sometimes, I wondered if loneliness could actually grow, like a vine wrapping itself tighter around your heart with every passing year. Lately, it had been squeezing harder than ever, and tonight was one of those nights when the silence felt unbearable. As I walked toward the living room, I braced myself. It wasn't that Evan and I didn't get along. In fact, we barely spoke beyond polite exchanges. But there was something about his presence that unsettled me. Maybe it was the way he carried his pain, so quietly, so deeply. It was a mirror I didn't want to look into, a reflection of all the things I'd buried inside myself. When I stepped into the room, there he was, sitting on the couch, staring at the TV. A romantic movie was playing, though he didn't seem to be paying much attention to it. He turned when he heard me, his expression somewhere between startled and apologetic. "Did I wake you?" he asked, his voice low and unsure. I shook my head, offering a faint smile. "No, I just couldn't sleep." The truth was, I hadn't slept well in years, but I didn't feel like explaining that. Instead, I gestured toward the glass in my hand. "Just getting some water." He nodded and looked back at the screen, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he seemed to be bracing for something, maybe judgment, maybe pity. I wasn't sure which. In that moment, I wanted to say something, to ease the weight he was carrying, even if only a little. But what could I say? That I understood? That I knew what it felt like to have the rug pulled out from under you, to have your life crumble in an instant? Would it even matter? Words never seemed enough. So I stood there for a moment longer, caught between wanting to stay and needing to escape. Eventually, I chose the latter, retreating back to the kitchen and leaving him to his thoughts. As I refilled my glass, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something, not just for Evan, but for me too. The kind of beginning that doesn't come with warnings, the kind that changes everything. The room seemed smaller, more intimate, as if the quiet between us had its own weight. I watched the flickering images on the TV, but my thoughts were far from the glossy romance unfolding on screen. Evan shifted beside me, the couch creaking softly beneath his weight, and I couldn't help but notice how even the smallest sound seemed amplified in the stillness. "It's been a while since I sat down and just watched something," Evan said, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, tinged with exhaustion. "Life's been so chaotic lately, I don't even know how to just stop." I turned my head slightly, catching the profile of his face as he stared ahead. "Sometimes stopping is the hardest thing," I said quietly. "It's easier to keep moving, pretending everything's fine." Evan glanced at me, his eyes shadowed but searching. "You sound like you know that feeling." I nodded, holding his gaze for a moment before looking away. "I do. After James died, I spent years trying to keep myself busy. It felt like if I ever stopped, I'd just collapse." His expression softened, the tension in his shoulders easing a little. "I get that," he said. "It's like you're running from something, but you don't even know what anymore." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken truths. I took a sip of water, the coolness doing little to calm the sudden tightness in my throat. The television played on, but neither of us was paying attention. Instead, we sat there, two people caught in the same storm, finding an odd kind of solace in the shared silence. After a while, Evan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I feel like I don't even recognize myself anymore," he admitted. "The person I thought I was, the life I thought I had, it's all gone. Just like that." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him things would get better, but the truth was, I didn't know if they would. Instead, I said the only thing I could. "It's okay to feel lost, Evan. It doesn't mean you'll stay that way." He looked at me, his eyes glassy with emotion. "Do you ever stop missing him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "James, I mean." The question caught me off guard, a sharp pang shooting through my chest. I swallowed hard, my gaze dropping to the glass in my hands. "No," I said finally, "but it changes. The pain, it softens over time. It doesn't go away, but it becomes something you can carry." Evan nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as he processed my words. For a moment, I thought he might cry, but he didn't. Instead, he straightened up, forcing a weak smile. "You make it sound almost bearable." "Some days it is," I replied. "Other days, not so much. But you keep going anyway." He leaned back against the couch, exhaling deeply. "I don't know if I can keep going," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "It's like everything I built, everything I thought I could trust, just crumbled." I reached out, hesitating for only a second before placing my hand gently on his arm. "You can," I said firmly. "You're stronger than you think, Evan. Even if it doesn't feel like it right now." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper. The warmth of his skin beneath my hand sent a strange shiver through me, but I ignored it, focusing instead on the connection we were beginning to forge. "Thank you," he said softly. "I don't think anyone said that to me in a long time." "You don't have to thank me," I replied, my voice steady. "That's what family's for." Evan smiled faintly, a shadow of his former self peeking through. "Still," he said, "it means a lot." We sat like that for a while longer, the tension easing slightly but never fully dissipating. The night stretched on, and though the silence between us remained, it felt different now, less like an empty void and more like the start of something unspoken, waiting to be understood. The room grew quieter as the night deepened, the soft hum of the television blending with the rhythm of our breathing. Evan had relaxed into the couch, his posture slightly slouched, though his eyes remained distant. I too sank further into my seat, the warmth of his presence beginning to chip away at the invisible walls I had so carefully built around myself. It felt strange to share a moment like this, a quiet intimacy that neither of us had expected, but somehow felt inevitable. The movie continued playing, a romance unfolding on the screen. The characters whispered words of devotion, their faces illuminated by candlelight. I caught myself staring, not at the story, but at the way it stirred something deep inside me, a yearning I hadn't felt in years. The scene shifted to a kiss, slow and deliberate, and my chest tightened. "Do you believe in that?" Evan asked suddenly, his voice breaking the spell. I turned to him, startled. "In what?" "In love like that," he said, nodding toward the screen. "The kind that doesn't fall apart no matter what." I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I think I used to," I admitted finally. With James, it felt unshakable, like nothing could touch us. But then life proved me wrong. Evan nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I thought I had that too. Turns out I was just fooling myself." There was a bitterness in his tone that made my heart ache. I wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease his pain, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I shifted slightly, and without thinking, my arm brushed against his. It was an innocent movement, accidental, but the contact sent a spark through me that I couldn't ignore. "Sorry," I said quickly, pulling away. Evan shook his head. "You don't have to apologize." His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure whether to say more. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I noticed the shadows under his eyes, the lines of worry etched into his face. He was so much younger than me, yet he carried the weight of someone who had lived far longer than his years. I wanted to reach out again, to offer some kind of comfort, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The silence between us grew heavier, filled with all the things we weren't saying. The movie played on, its romantic melodies weaving through the air, but neither of us paid attention anymore. My heart was racing, though I couldn't say why. I felt a strange pull toward him, an ache that had nothing to do with logic or reason. It was confusing, overwhelming, and utterly impossible to ignore. "Megan," Evan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm doing here." I frowned, confused. "Here in the house?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "Here. With you. Sitting here like this. It doesn't make sense, but it feels like—" He trailed off, his words hanging in the air. "Like what?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. "Like I'm not as alone as I thought," he said, meeting my eyes. His gaze was raw, unguarded, and it sent a shiver through me. I looked away, my hands clenching in my lap. "You're not alone," I said quietly. "Neither of us is." The words felt truer than anything I'd said in years, but they also terrified me, because in that moment, I realized that whatever was happening between us wasn't something I could easily explain or stop. It was a force all its own, pulling us closer together, whether we were ready for it or not. Evan shifted beside me, his arm brushing mine again, but this time neither of us moved away. The tension between us was electric, unspoken but undeniable. I wanted to say something, to break the moment before it swallowed us whole, but the words caught in my throat. And so, we sat there side by side, the lines between us blurring in the quiet glow of the night. The first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, casting a faint glow across my bedroom walls. Sleep had eluded me entirely. My thoughts were restless, looping back to the previous night, to the quiet moments on the couch and the tension I still couldn't name. I stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all, but the answers never came. Instead, I felt a pull, a need to ground myself in something familiar, something safe. The piano. Sliding out of bed, I wrapped my robe around me and padded softly into the living room. The house was still and quiet, but the air felt heavier, as if it carried the echoes of things unspoken. I sat down on the bench, my fingers hovering above the keys for a moment before I began to play. The melody came instinctively, a soft tune James had loved. It had always been my refuge, a way to lose myself when the world became too overwhelming. As the notes filled the room, I felt a faint sense of calm returning, though it was fragile, like a thread that might snap at any moment. My thoughts wandered to James, to the mornings we used to share, the laughter, the plans for a future that had vanished too soon. The weight of his absence pressed against me, but I kept playing, letting the music carry me through the ache. I didn't hear Evan come in. It wasn't until I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye that I realized he was standing in the doorway, watching me. I froze mid-note, my hands trembling slightly on the keys. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said softly, stepping further into the room. "That was beautiful." I shook my head, letting out a shaky breath. "You didn't interrupt. I needed a moment." Evan nodded, his gaze lingering on the piano. It sounded like more than a moment. It sounded like home. His words caught me off guard, and I looked at him, searching for the meaning behind them. There was something in his eyes, a quiet understanding that made me feel exposed but also strangely seen. "It used to be," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "When James was alive, the piano was the heart of this house. Now it's just a memory." Evan stepped closer, his movements careful, as if he didn't want to intrude. "I know what it's like to hold on to something that feels like a memory," he said. "It's both comforting and painful." I nodded, my fingers brushing against the keys absent-mindedly. "It is, but sometimes it's all we have." For a moment we stood there in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken emotion. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Evan sat down on the bench beside me. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough to shift the atmosphere. "Do you play?" I asked, breaking the quiet. Evan gave a small smile, his fingers trailing over the keys without pressing down. "A little. My mom made me take lessons when I was a kid. I wasn't great, but I learned enough to get by." "Play something," I said, surprising even myself with the suggestion. He hesitated, glancing at me as if to gauge whether I was serious. Then, with a deep breath, he began to play. The melody was hesitant at first, but as his confidence grew, it smoothed out into something hauntingly familiar. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized it, my favorite piece, the one James used to play for me on quiet evenings. "How do you know this?" I asked, my voice catching in my throat. Evan didn't look up, his focus entirely on the keys. "I don't know. It just came to me." The room seemed to shrink around us, the music filling every corner with a raw, aching beauty. Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes, and I turned away, not wanting him to see how deeply it affected me. But he must have noticed, because when the last note faded, he placed a hand gently on mine. "Megan," he said softly, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "You don't have to hide it." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and in that moment, I saw not just a man carrying his own pain, but someone willing to share mine. It was a kind of connection I hadn't felt in years, and it left me breathless. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice trembling, "for playing that." Evan smiled, a quiet warmth in his expression. It felt like the right thing to do. We sat there together, side by side on the bench, the silence between us now filled with something softer, more forgiving. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. And maybe, just maybe, neither was he. The day passed in a haze of half-finished tasks and restless thoughts. By the time the evening arrived, the weight of the morning had eased slightly, replaced by a quiet anticipation. Evan's casual mention of his birthday lingered in my mind, a small detail I couldn't ignore. I had spent so long without anyone to celebrate or share these moments with that I found myself wanting to make the day feel significant, even if only in a small way. I rummaged through the kitchen, finding a bottle of red wine that had been tucked away for years, a leftover from a time when James and I would toast to the simplest joys. A quick search revealed an old box of cake mix in the pantry, slightly past its prime, but good enough. As I mixed the batter, the scent of chocolate filled the air, warming the house in a way I hadn't realized it needed. When Evan walked into the kitchen, his hair damp from a shower and a fresh shirt clinging to him, he stopped short at the sight of me frosting the small cake. His eyebrows rose in surprise. "What's this?" he asked, stepping closer, the corners of his mouth lifting into a faint smile. "It's your birthday," I said, turning to face him. "I figured we could celebrate, even if it's just the two of us." For a moment, he didn't say anything, his gaze moving from the cake to the wine sitting on the counter. Then, with a quiet chuckle, he leaned against the doorway. "I wasn't expecting this." "Sometimes, it's the unexpected things that mean the most," I replied, trying to sound lighthearted but feeling the weight of the truth in my words. He looked at me then, his expression softening. "Thank you, Megan. Really." I nodded, brushing off the gratitude as I lit a single candle on the cake. "Come on," I said, motioning for him to sit at the small dining table. "Let's make this official." We sat across from each other, the candle flickering between us. For a moment, the house felt alive again, filled with a kind of warmth I hadn't experienced in years. Evan closed his eyes briefly as he blew out the candle, his wish remaining a silent secret. As we sipped the wine, the conversation began to flow more easily. We talked about nothing and everything, his childhood, my memories with James, the quirks of small-town life. The wine loosened our words, and soon we were laughing in a way that felt genuine, unforced. But as the night wore on, the air between us began to shift. The laughter faded, replaced by a quieter, more introspective tone. Evan leaned back in his chair, his glass of wine cradled in his hand as he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You know," he said, his voice low, This is the first time in years I've actually felt seen. I tilted my head, unsure of how to respond. What do you mean? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. It's hard to explain. My marriage, it was like I was just there. A fixture in someone else's life, not really a part of it. I didn't even realize how much of myself I'd lost until it was all gone. His words struck a chord in me, echoing the hollow spaces I'd carried since James's death. I think I understand, I said softly. After James, I didn't just lose him. I lost who I was with him. Evan nodded, his eyes meeting mine. It's a strange thing, isn't it? To feel like a stranger in your own life. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared understanding filling the room. Then, as if seeking to break the tension, Evan raised his glass with a small smile. To feeling seen, he said. To feeling seen, I echoed, clinking my glass against his. The moment should have ended there, but it didn't. Instead, the quiet stretched on, the space between us seeming smaller than before. Evan's gaze lingered on me, his expression unreadable but intense. I felt my heart begin to race, a mix of fear and something I couldn't quite name. You know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, you have this way of making people feel safe. I laughed softly, trying to deflect the intensity of his words. I'm not sure I'd call frosting a cake a superpower. But Evan didn't smile. It's more than that, he said. It's the way you listen, the way you don't judge. I didn't realize how much I needed that until now. His words left me breathless, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't untangle. I looked away, focusing on the flicker of the candle's flame, but I could still feel his gaze on me, warm and unwavering. Evan, I started, but my voice faltered. I didn't know what I was going to say, only that I needed to say something before the moment carried us further than I was ready to go. He leaned forward slightly, his hand resting on the table between us. Megan, The words hung in the air, unfinished but heavy with meaning. I stared at his hand, the space between us feeling impossibly small, and for a fleeting moment, I didn't want to close it. But instead, I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I think we've had enough wine for one night, I said, forcing a smile that felt brittle. Let's save the rest of the cake for tomorrow. Evan watched me, his expression unreadable, before nodding slowly. Yeah, he said quietly. Good idea. As I retreated to my room, my heart still racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something we couldn't take back. And yet, a part of me couldn't help but wonder what would happen if we fell. Scene 6, the unforgettable night. The house was shrouded in silence, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. I had retreated to my bedroom after the birthday celebration, hoping to calm the storm inside me, but the stillness only seemed to amplify my thoughts. The warmth of Evan's words, the way his eyes had lingered on mine, everything about the evening felt like a thread pulling tighter and tighter, binding us in ways I couldn't explain. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, the faint hum of the wine still buzzing in my veins. Sleep felt like an impossibility. My mind kept circling back to the unspoken tension between us, the way it seemed to grow with every passing moment. I couldn't shake the memory of his voice, low and hesitant, as though he was holding back something he wasn't ready to share. The need for air became overwhelming. Grabbing my robe, I slipped out of my room and down the hall. The faint glow of the living room lamp spilled into the corridor, and as I turned the corner, I saw him. Evan was sitting on the couch, his head leaning back against the cushion, his eyes closed. The empty wine glass rested on the coffee table, the bottle half full beside it. For a moment, I thought he might be asleep, but as I stepped closer, his eyes fluttered open. He blinked at me, the shadows of fatigue etched across his face. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice husky from the quiet. I shook my head, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, I didn't know why I'd come back out. Maybe it was the pull of his presence, or maybe it was the need to make sense of the growing complexity between us. Neither could I, he admitted, sitting up and rubbing the back of his neck. Too much on my mind, I guess. I hesitated before walking toward the couch, the floor creaking softly beneath my bare feet. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Talking doesn't always help," he said. "Sometimes it just makes things messier." I understood what he meant. Words had a way of complicating things, of giving shape to feelings we weren't ready to confront. But even as he said it, I could see the weight of everything he wasn't saying pressing down on him. I sat down at the other end of the couch, careful to keep some distance between us. The silence stretched out, heavy but not uncomfortable. The dim light softened the room, casting long shadows across the walls, and for a moment it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Evan broke the silence first. "You know, I didn't expect tonight to feel good," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I thought it would just be another day to get through." "It's been a long time since I've celebrated anything," I admitted. I wasn't sure I even remembered how. He looked at me then, his expression soft but intense. "You made it feel real," he said, like I mattered. I didn't realize how much I needed that. His words sent a wave of emotion through me, and I had to look away, afraid he might see too much in my eyes. "Everyone needs to feel like they matter," I said quietly, "even when it's hard to believe." He didn't reply, but I felt the shift in the air between us, the unspoken tension tightening again. I could sense him watching me, the weight of his gaze like a tangible thing, and my heart began to race. "Megan," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding wrong." I turned to him, my breath catching in my throat. "Then don't say it," I whispered, not sure if I was pleading or warning. But he didn't look away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. "You make me feel something I haven't felt in a long time," he said, "and I don't know what to do with that." My chest tightened, a mix of fear and longing surging through me. "Evan, we can't," I started, but the words faltered, caught in the swirl of emotions I couldn't untangle. "I know," he said quickly, his voice rough. "I know it's complicated, and I know it doesn't make sense. But sitting here with you, it feels like I can breathe again." His honesty disarmed me, leaving me vulnerable in a way I hadn't been in years. The distance between us felt insurmountable and yet impossibly small. I wanted to reach out, to close the gap, but I was terrified of what that might mean. Without thinking, I shifted closer, the movement almost involuntary. His eyes met mine, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. The weight of everything, our pain, our loneliness, our shared understanding, pressed down on us, binding us in a moment that felt both fragile and unbreakable. "I don't know what this is," I said finally, my voice trembling, "but it scares me." "Me too," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's there, isn't it?" I nodded, unable to deny the truth of it. And as we sat there, the space between us shrinking, I realized that no matter how much I tried to resist, some things couldn't be ignored. The night felt endless, filled with a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying, and I knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sunlight spilled through the cracks in the curtains, casting golden streaks across the living room floor. I blinked awake on the couch, the soft murmur of birdsong from outside blending with the faint hum of my thoughts. My head felt heavy, not from the wine, but from the weight of everything that had passed the night before. My robe was wrapped tightly around me, though it did little to shield me from the chill of reality settling in. The memory of the night came rushing back in vivid flashes, the quiet tension, the words we had shared, the invisible line that had blurred until it was impossible to define. I sat up slowly, trying to steady the pounding in my chest. Across the room, the kitchen light flickered on, and I knew I wasn't alone. Evan was there, standing at the counter with his back to me. His shoulders were hunched slightly as he poured water into the coffee machine, his movements slow and deliberate. He hadn't noticed me yet, or maybe he had and was pretending not to. Either way, the silence between us felt louder than anything else. I stood, adjusting my robe as I crossed the room. "Good morning," I said softly, my voice breaking the quiet. Evan turned, his eyes meeting mine for just a moment before shifting back to the coffee pot. "Morning," he replied, his tone neutral, though there was an unmistakable undercurrent of unease. I lingered near the edge of the counter, unsure of what to say. The air between us felt different now, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions and the knowledge that something had shifted. The words I had rehearsed in my head during the restless hours of the night seemed to dissolve as soon as I tried to speak them. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked, my attempt at casual conversation falling flat. He shrugged, pouring a cup of coffee and sliding it toward me without a word. I accepted it, the warmth of the mug grounding me for a brief moment. "About last night?" I started, but he cut me off, his voice quiet but firm. "We don't have to talk about it," he said, his eyes fixed on the counter. "I think we both know it was a mistake." The word hung in the air, sharp and definitive. A mistake. My chest tightened, though I wasn't sure if it was from relief or something else entirely. I nodded, gripping the mug tightly. "You're right. It shouldn't have happened." Evan looked up then, his expression a mix of regret and something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. "It's not that it didn't mean anything," he said carefully, "but it's complicated, and I don't want to make things harder for either of us." I exhaled slowly, the truth of his words settling over me like a weight. He was right. Whatever had passed between us, whatever feelings had surfaced, there was no path forward that wouldn't leave us both in pieces. "I think we were both just lonely," I said, my voice trembling slightly. And in that moment, it felt like we could feel the emptiness. But it's not real. Evan nodded, though his gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than necessary. "Maybe not," he said softly, but it felt real. The raw honesty in his voice sent a shiver through me, and I looked away, focusing on the coffee in my hands. It had felt real, more real than anything I had allowed myself to feel in years. But that didn't make it right. "We can't let this change things," I said firmly, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, him or myself. "We're family, Evan. We need to remember that." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't make it any easier." The silence between us stretched on, filled with all the things we couldn't say. Finally, Evan pushed away from the counter, his hands shoved into his pockets as he leaned against the wall. "Maybe I should go," he said abruptly. "I think some space might be what we both need." His words sent a pang through me, sharp and unexpected, but I nodded, forcing myself to smile. "If you think that's best." He looked at me then, his eyes soft and filled with something that looked a lot like sorrow. "Megan, I don't want you to think that you don't mean anything to me, because you do. You've been more to me in these past weeks than anyone has in years." My throat tightened, and I struggled to keep my composure. "And you've reminded me what it feels like to connect with someone," I said, my voice wavering. "But it doesn't change what's right." Evan nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as he pushed off the wall. "I'll pack my things," he said, turning toward the hallway. I stood there for a moment after he left, the warmth of the coffee seeping into my palms, but doing little to ease the ache in my chest. I had wanted to set things right, to make sense of the chaos between us, but all I felt was an emptiness that seemed deeper than before. When Evan returned with his bag slung over his shoulder, he paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "For everything." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond, and then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving the house quiet once more. As I stood in the empty kitchen, the reality of the morning settled over me. We had done the right thing, I told myself, even if it didn't feel like it. But as the silence pressed in around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost something I might never find again. The house was quiet again, almost oppressively so. The absence of Evan's presence was palpable, like a missing piece in the fabric of my home. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The echo of our last conversation played in my mind, each word etched with finality. I told myself we had done the right thing. What had unfolded between us was a fleeting mistake born of loneliness and shared pain. It didn't define us. It couldn't. But no matter how many times I repeated those words, they felt hollow, as if I were trying to convince myself of something I didn't fully believe. The hours passed slowly, dragging one into the next. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt foreign, like a shell of something it had been before. Evan's belongings were gone, his shoes no longer by the door, his faint scent already fading from the guest room. I found myself wandering through the house aimlessly, pausing at places where his presence had felt strongest: the couch, the kitchen, the piano. The memories clung to these spaces, refusing to let go. It wasn't until late afternoon that I finally sat down at the piano. My fingers hovered above the keys, hesitant, unsure. The silence in the room felt heavy, but I knew I needed to break it. Slowly, I began to play, the melody soft and familiar. It was the same piece Evan had played for me, the one that had stirred something deep inside me. As the notes filled the air, I closed my eyes, letting the music carry me back to that moment. I could still see him sitting beside me, his hands moving across the keys with a confidence that belied the vulnerability in his voice. I could still feel the weight of his words, the way they had settled over me like a warm blanket and a storm all at once. The music faltered as my hands stilled, my chest tightening with the weight of everything I hadn't said. I had spent so much time running from my emotions, burying them beneath routine and solitude, that I hadn't realized how deeply I'd craved connection until it was staring me in the face. And now it was gone, leaving behind an ache that felt impossible to soothe. The sound of my phone buzzing broke through my thoughts. I glanced at it, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Evan's name on the screen. For a moment I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. Then, with a deep breath, I pressed it. "Hello?" My voice was softer than I intended, tinged with uncertainty. "Megan," Evan said, his tone steady but layered with emotion. I needed to call. I'm sorry if this is out of line." "No," I said quickly. "It's not. I'm glad you did." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that carried more weight than words. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking about what we said this morning, about needing space, and you're right. It's the logical thing to do, but it doesn't make it any easier." I closed my eyes, leaning back against the piano bench. "No, it doesn't. But it's what we need to do, Evan. For both of us." "I know," he said, his voice quieter now. "But that doesn't mean I won't miss you." His honesty was like a knife, cutting through the walls I had tried to rebuild. "I'll miss you too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "More than I probably should." Another silence stretched between us, but this one felt different. Softer, almost comforting. "I don't regret meeting you," he said finally. "Even with everything that's happened, I don't regret a single moment." Tears welled in my eyes, and I wiped them away quickly, even though he couldn't see me. "Neither do I said. "You reminded me what it feels like to be alive again. I'll always be grateful for that." His sigh on the other end of the line was heavy but resigned. "Take care of yourself, Megan," he said, "and if you ever need anything, I'm just a call away." "You too, Evan," I replied, my voice trembling. "I mean it." When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, the phone still clutched in my hand. The ache in my chest was sharper now, but it felt cleaner somehow, like a wound that had finally been aired out. I wasn't sure what the future held, whether our paths would ever cross again, or if this was truly the end. But for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the house in warm light, I opened the windows and let the fresh air in. The silence felt different now, less like a void and more like a canvas waiting to be filled. I sat at the piano once more, my hands finding a new melody, one that wasn't tied to the past or weighed down by regret. It was a beginning, not just for me, but for Evan too. We had given each other something neither of us realized we needed, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, connection was still possible. And as the music filled the room, I let myself believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, we had both found a way forward.